I think we'll make a start, and we'll let other people join when they can. So very good afternoon. My name is Narissa Taysom and I manage the public programme for the Foundling Museum, and a very warm welcome if you're joining us virtually for the first time. I'm delighted to have Adrian Seville give us a talk today about the Forgotten Sites of Victorian London, a pocket handkerchief tour. Which is going to be absolutely delightful, I'm sure. This talk is part of our ongoing series of lunchtime talks. We run them every single month, and if you enjoy today's talk, please do come back for a future talk. All of the details can be found on our website. Just a reminder that today's talk is being recorded, and we will be sharing the link to that recording when it goes live on YouTube in the next few weeks. And if you have any questions, which I'm sure you will, you can ask us those through the chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen. And I will field those questions to Adrian at the end of the talk. So the talk will be about 45 minutes, followed by a sort of 10-15-minute Q&A. And please do ask questions. This is such a great time for us to be in dialogue with an expert like Adrian. Adrian Seville is an international expert on the history of printed board games, specializing in research on the cultural history of the game of the goose. He has published widely on these games, speaking about them in Europe and in America. His recent book, The Cultural Legacy of the Royal Game of the Goose, was published by Amsterdam University Press and is the first comprehensive academic study of the genre. And he is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in London. So it's a very warm welcome to you, Adrian, and thank you for joining us. And I will hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Narissa, and thanks to everybody for joining. We're going on a rather special tour of Victorian London through the agency of a rather special pocket handkerchief. The handkerchief, as you now see, contains a game, a new and amusing game, London Sights, or All Round St. Paul's. And of course, we are, as modern people, are used to these games, and you look at it and you say, ah, yes, I know what that is. It's going to be a sort of race game. Everybody is going to have a distinctive token. We'll probably have some counters for money, and we'll throw the dice and get moving. Not quite right. This is what is on the handkerchief. The directions for playing. The game is played with the teetotum, numbered on the sides. Now, this is a teetotum. It's a little spinning top. And the reason for having this instead of dice, well, you can say that dice were thought of as bad because they were associated with gambling. But there's another reason. Back in 1710, the Gambling Act, put a heavy duty, pretty much like a week's wages, on a pair of dice, and it eventually went up to 10 shillings. The same duty was on anything that substituted for dice, anything numbered. The manufacturers were equal to it. What they did was to produce a blank spinning top like the one on the right, and said, if you want to play this game, you should number the sides. And there is a numbered one, hand numbered, not very well. So this takes us back to the time before the duty on dice was repealed in the 1860s. And so we are dealing with a mid-Victorian, mid-19th century game. Now, what I'm going to do is to look a little bit at the game we've got, and then I'm going to turn and give you a short history of these games, talk a little bit about printing on handkerchiefs, and then we'll go and start our tour looking at the forgotten sites of London. We begin in a good place, the Bank of England. Whoever gets here receives a counter from every other player. And down the sides of the game, these little instructions with pretty terrible rhyming verses. The storehouse of England, known of old for new banknotes and glittering gold. That's one of the better ones, I have to say. But there's number one. Number two, the British Museum. Here you wait while the others spin twice. Then Buckingham Palace, Her Majesty's residence spacious and grand. And we pass on to Kensington Gardens further down the spiral. And finally on this section, Burlington Arcade, where we stop one turn to see the fashions. And indeed, the hazards and the penalties and the rewards are entirely familiar. The game is not particularly innovative. So let's see where these games come from. This is a very short history of a very long subject, but I want to begin with the earliest dated goose game, printed right at the end of the 16th century in Rome. And you'll see it's the spiral race game, trying to race from the bottom left, that little jester figure, to the number 63, which is the winning space just below the central oval where the rules are. Now that game, although it was known in Italy, mostly through laws trying to ban it for gambling in the 15th century, mid-15th century, didn't come to London until about this 1598 time, the end of the 16th century. And although we don't have a game as early as that, we do have 17th century games. And this is probably the earliest by John Overton in London. And you can see just how similar it is, in fact, to the Italian original. In fact, if we look closely, we can see a bit of borrowing has gone on. You see these gentlemen enjoying their drinks at the end of the game. They've obviously won, and they're very similar in both games. So we have an Italian heritage for these goose games. Why is it called the game of the goose? You will say, well, simplest explanation is that geese are considered lucky in Italy. And you'll see that there are a lot of geese. Every time you land on a goose, you double your throw. So generally speaking, they're lucky. If you overthrow, there's a very clever rule which says if you have too many points at the end, you count them backwards. So you might indeed land on a goose and then you double your throw, but now you're going backwards. So it's a very clever and exciting game. But getting to the center is not absolutely straightforward. There are hazards, just as there are on our pocket handkerchief. And I won't deal with them all, but you see at the top left, there is the well. If you land in the well, you have to wait till somebody gets there and helps you out, but they then take your place. Number 42 on the right, the labyrinth, you've lost your way and you have to go back a few spaces. And worst of all, at the top, the death space on 58, where you have to start again. So a good and interesting game. When this game, the game of human life, was produced in 1790, it was a straight borrowing from a French game, 1775. And although it doesn't look quite like our original goose game, it's still a spiral. The numbers go up to 84 rather than 63, and that is because it's an adaptation, turning it into the 7 ages of man, the 7 12s making 84. And there are the 7 ages of man, and the numbers 12, 24, and so on are the periods of life. You'll see that at 72, you get into decrepitude. I can't ask for hands up, but you know what I mean. And there on 84, the winning space, in fact, shows Sir Isaac Newton in his Cambridge doctoral robes. So it's a nice take, an adaptation on the original game of goose. And the hazards are clever as well. Here we have the prodigal. You see, he's giving his money to the poor, just frittering it away, and he has to go back to the careless boy at number 6, shown building a house of cards, which is a sort of Georgian trope for a wasted youth spent in idle pursuits. So this heritage of goose games, cleverly adapted, operated a bit in England, more so in France, in the Netherlands, even in Germany and Italy. But in England, it was rather lost sight of, although the pattern remained very much the same. Here is the magic ring, 1796. And you'll see it's just a spiral race game. Looks, in fact, physically very much like our handkerchief. If we look more closely, we shall see that it's got all sorts of fairy tale hazards, wizards, witches, burning fires, all sorts of things, until the knight reaches his goal at number 50 with the magic ring. Looking at the first 4 spaces, as we did for our handkerchief game, we see a very similar sort of thing. Say number 2, the walk, gets 4 counters out of the bank. Rose gets 2 counters from every player. And the hamper, if he knocks it over and breaks the bottles, he has to pay, and every person has to help repair the damage. So we can see that our handkerchief is not unlike this sort of game. Let's move on and see something which is even closer to home, because we here have a panorama of London, a day's journey around the metropolis. And the early 1800s, tourism was beginning to get underway, and these games catered for it. It's a beautiful game, in fact. If you look carefully at the centre, you find a wonderful prospect of St. Paul's, the ceremonial barges sailing up the river. And it's a valuable witness to various sites of London, just as our handkerchief game is. For example, if we look at the space number 47, just below the central oval, we see Bartholomew Fair, and we pay for seeing the humours of Mr. Punch. You see Mr. Punch's booth on the left, and then the acrobats in the booth of Sanders in the centre. Moving on, even closer, a survey of London by a party of tarry-at-home travellers, and there, in fact, the winning space, just as our handkerchief game, is in fact St. Paul's, beautifully engraved. So we have quite a number of precedents for this game. What I don't have is a game on paper which is the same as the handkerchief game. And you'll see why I'm interested in that when I move on to the handkerchief itself, printed in red ink on calico, a rather rough sort of cotton cloth, imported from India, hence the name. And it's something that was being done in England from about the beginning of the 18th century. And here we have one printed by a well-known printer, Mary Ware. The Wares of Crayford were well known for calico printing. This rather beautiful one showing different kinds of dogs, all the sportsman's delight. And there are other examples of games that are printed on a handkerchief. And here is one. This isn't the same as a spiral race game. It's got different choices of path, and they're determined by spinning a teetotum. But this time it's labeled not with numbers, but with forward, back, left, and right, which tell you where to turn at each particular intersection, and you're trying to get from the bottom up to the top, the cottage of content. And there's a moral lesson in this, where there are good places and not so good places to go. And we see on the right, printed in red as ours is, the game neatly arranged, slightly changed to fit the handkerchief with some instructions on it. And that's in the Coatson Library at Princeton. But as I say, I haven't got an original for our game. So with that introduction, let's do our tour. And what I'm going to concentrate on is not all the sites that we see on the handkerchief, but just those which perhaps have been forgotten, or you may not know much about, or perhaps which just interested me as I had a look at this game. There it is, just to remind you, with the spiral. And as we go along the spiral, this is the first that I've chosen, the electric telegraph, showing how it was in the City of London, the station in 1848. If you went into the Great Hall there, you would be able to pass a telegram through all England, because from this little spot, the wires extend by which through all England expresses they send, expresses meaning express telegrams. And we stop one turn to see it work. But before we see it work, let's have a look at it today, because this is Founders Court, just near the Bank of England. And on the left, as it was when it was a central telegraph station, and as it is now. And you'll see that the entrance is pretty much the same as it was, a bit less elaborate. And let's go inside into the Victorian telegraph station, and we would be looking for the machines, if we were an operator, that were something like this. And there were keys, as you see, 2 keys for each of 5 needles, and the needles then pointed along the diagonal lines. 2 needles would point to a particular letter, so you could read it. And this was sent down the wires, mostly along wires which were set up along the railway lines, and this got you all over England and eventually all over the world. There we have a telegram a little later than our game, I think, 1868, being sent to the Reform Club at Pall Mall. One of the features of this telegraph system is going to interest you, I think. In 1844, a man called John Taywell was arrested in Slough for the murder of his mistress, or bigamous common law wife, whichever you like to call it, in Slough. He bought some cyanide, and he was spotted emerging from the house. And the police in Slough sent word to Paddington Station that this man had got on the train, and they gave a description. He is in the garb of a Quaker, with a brown coat on which reaches nearly to his feet. Now, why did they spell Quaker that way? Well, look back at the diagram and you'll see there is no letter Q. So they had to improvise, and KW was the best they could manage. And after a number of repetitions, the Paddington Station people caught on, the police were alerted, and John Taywell was arrested. There he is being tried at Aylesbury, standing in the dock, and he was duly convicted and hanged. And this use of the telegraph got a tremendous amount of publicity, and so the telegraph became an important and very well used instrument, particularly for business. Hence the establishment of our telegraph station in the City of London, not the first London station, but the first one in the financial city. Now, this is probably familiar to you. Here is the Foundling Hospital, established in 1742, erected for children deserted to aid by good Captain Coram. The first stone was laid. I'm telling you nothing that you don't know. But there, the view on the handkerchief is repeated in a contemporary engraving of the Foundling Hospital. And what a sight it was. This is a bird's eye view, but you see just the scale of the place. It's really enormous. I mean, it's like the present Brunswick shopping centre and probably more. It's just huge. And if we look inside at the chapel, etching by Rowlandson, 1808, you'll see just how many children there were, with all sorts of supporters, dignitaries, and so on, all being preached to from a wonderful three-tier pulpit. So the Foundling Hospital was an important part of London. Here then, in our next slide, is the Lowther Arcade. Now, you heard of the Burlington Arcade, but this arcade is often so crammed with a throng of buyers you scarcely can get well along. You scarcely can write very good verse either. But it was a very impressive arcade, beautifully lit from the top, nicely decorated, very fashionable. Where was it? Well, it was in the Strand, and I managed to find a much later photograph. It was there until the early 20th century. There is the Lowther Arcade shown on a shop, shown above the shop sign level on the left in the Strand, with all the horses and carriages and 1 to 2 motor buses. And on the right, I've got a map from about 1890, which shows exactly where the Lowther Arcade was, just between the Strand and King William Street and Adelaide Street on the left. I couldn't resist showing you this picture of the Lowther Arcade a bit later on. It was originally designed to be filled with the high-end shops, but it became very much a place of toy shops. And there you see toy shops with different names: Noah's Ark, Arcadia, the Toy Man, and the little girl choosing her next doll. This is quite a contrast. The Missionary Museum, which was in Finsbury Square, many curious, odd-looking things as idols of heathens and clubs for their kings. Really, as Christianity spread, quite a lot of the artifacts that had been used for the pagan religions got sent back to London. And the family idols of Pomare are shown here. Pomare is in fact the name, was in fact the name of the ruling royal family of the Tahiti. And the ruler had sent the idols to the missionaries at Amio, either to be burnt or sent to the Missionary Society. And there they are. There is in fact Pomare, Queen of Tahiti, in a somewhat later picture, I think. And we can look inside at the Missionary Museum, and we see some idols on the right, which are attracting the attention of these 2 very nicely dressed little girls. And then on the left, someone is expounding to the mother and child on what's on the table. But all around you see spears, arrows, all the trappings of a really fine missionary museum. And now we move on to the Pantheon. The Pantheon was originally a very grand Georgian building built in 1772. And the verse says that we're going to see toys here, but that's not what it was built for. If we look at it in its original splendor of the late 18th century, we can see what a beautiful building it was. In fact, it was probably regarded as one of the finest buildings in Europe. It was used for all sorts of exhibitions, and here it's showing Lunardi's balloon, and obviously a popular spectacle, 1784. But sadly, it burnt down. And in 1792, we see this picture by Turner, just sadly labeled "The Morning After the Fire." And you see our beautiful Georgian building has in effect been gutted. It was, though, rebuilt, and the rebuild turned it into a bazaar. And the Pantheon Bazaar had indeed a whole number of things, including toys. We see all sorts of other things, vases and glasses on the left at the bottom, and then books, but clearly a very large and important shopping area. Before you ask where it is, I should have to say that it's still there. This is the Oxford Street Marks and Spencer. And until I had done some research for this talk, I didn't know that it was called the Pantheon branch and that it was labelled the Pantheon up there at the top, because if you're on Oxford Street, you very rarely look at the top of the Marks and Spencer's building. Another P, but this time for the Pantechnicon. And the Pantechnicon is still there, or at least its facade is still there. Behind the facade, when it opened in 1831, was an enormous warehouse, which was largely used as a furniture store, although there was some sale of awkwardly large things like the carriages for horse-drawn vehicles. But now, of course, it's a very upmarket restaurant and boutique place. But at the time that it was in of our Handkerchief, it had a much more humble association, particularly with these vans, which were used for transporting furniture and luggage around London, horse-drawn, as you see there, and they gave their name to these vehicles, and you see there the address, Belgrave Square. Motcombe Street, just off Belgrave Square, is where the Pantechnicon now is, and the Pantechnicon van became used by people other than the Pantechnicon firm, as you see here in this Camberwell Road example. Very handy for carrying furniture, a nice ramp, so you didn't have to bear all the weight, you could slide things about, and there it was. We move on to the Polytechnic in Regent Street. Now, if I say this is a forgotten site of London, I shall incur the wrath of the University of Westminster. But I think you'll see why I've included it, because it's not quite the same. It says you may list to lectures and view with delight the numerous articles offered to cite. Yes, but what could you see at the Polytechnic? Well, here is a playbill. You could see the diving bell, in which 4 or 5 persons may descend with safety. You had to pay, I think, £1 to go in the diving bell, and you went down in the pool and were fished out again with any ordinary luck. There's a diver who is working underwater. You see him there on the ladder, and people in their nice hats observing all these sights. The Polytechnic was under the charge of John Henry Pepper, shown here, and he had the title of professor. Now, because he was really an illusionist, a conjurer, if you like, but that was a title that illusionists very often used in the Victorian period. But then he really did become professor of the Royal Polytechnic Institution and became very respectable and well known. And there he is demonstrating the giant induction coil. And the giant induction coil was such as to produce an enormous spark and an enormous bang. And it must have been extremely satisfying to demonstrate. But his most famous illusion was Pepper's ghost. There's a slightly later playbill. Very ingenious. A large sheet of glass was placed between the audience and the stage, and the lights were dimmed. Underneath the stage, there was a projection arrangement whereby a bright light was shone on, in this case, a white-clad figure of a lady. And because of the physics of partial reflection, the audience could see her ghostly figure behind the glass. And then there was a real actor on stage, and he was terrified by the ghost. He tried to stab the ghost. Of course, this did it no harm. And in fact, he could walk through the ghost. So it's a splendid illusion. And I'm not surprised that they were producing it later on after the invention was first produced. We move on then to the Soho Bazaar in Soho Square, place of attraction with counters well filled for those who have cash. Yes, indeed, how things have not changed. There is the bazaar in Soho Square. It was basically a charitable institution designed to help gentlewomen who were producing some articles for sale, and they could get a legitimate income from it. But it didn't quite turn out that way. And in this Rowlandson cartoon, you'll see it was a very lively place. Let's look more closely. In fact, it got a bad reputation as a place of assignation. And on the left, that rather unpleasant gentleman leering away in green says, "Dear Countess, your husband's gone into the other room. I've slipped a letter into that book, naming time and place." And she says, "Very well, you rogue, be punctual." And the book is called Innocent Adultery. On the right, an assignation is made for the opera in the following evening. A different sort of entertainment now, the Surrey Zoological Gardens. And the verse is important. It says, "The animals, music, and fireworks at night afford to all people excessive delight." And I can put a date of not later than 1856 on this, because that is when the animals were moved away from the Surrey Zoological Gardens. Not the same as the Regent's Park Zoo. And you'll see the attractions listed there. I must say the harmonic rock band sounds very contemporary with our own age, but it must have been different. There are the zoological gardens, and then the band of the gardens with the military band and all sorts of things by Rossini, Strauss, and so on. Very, very appropriate. The menagerie contains a giraffe, only lately come to London. And so we move in and see what this place is like. But note the date of 1856, because that probably provides a date which means that our handkerchief was produced before, or not, at least not much later than the animals moved out. So 1856, remember. The animals were certainly there when Queen Victoria arrived to view it. And before you ask where it is, well, there is a ticket conveniently showing where it was, quite near the elephant, down the Kennington Road. But the main feature of the gardens was the stupendous backdrops that they produced. This is one showing some Indian architecture, and these backdrops were as much as 70, 80 feet high, wonderfully painted and produced, and put round a real lake, so as to give a great illusion. One of the most famous of the illusions was the representation of Vesuvius, and at night there were all sorts of fires and smoke and rumbles which were entertaining. A different sort of entertainment now, the Thames Tunnel, quite lately opened, 1843. The Brunels were the engineers, and you'll see how popular it is. That's a great crowd descending to have a look. It made use of this patent, the tunneling shield. Something very similar is used today for Crossrail, a bit more automated and engineered, but still the same principle of building the tunnel behind the shield as it moves forward on jacks. And it was a very well engineered and pleasant sort of place to stroll down if you like underground tunnels. But again, not quite all it seems, because as a place of assignation, it was not unknown for ladies of the night to appear behind one of the pillars. And you see there on the extreme right, a knowing face peering out, looking for custom. We move on to the United Service Museum, which was in Whitehall. And it mentions the much lauded model of famed Waterloo. Well, if you want to see the model of famed Waterloo, go to the Army Museum, Chelsea, and there you will see this enormous model with many thousands of small soldiers modeling the famous battle. We now move on to getting near the end of our tour to Wilde's Globe. And I'd never heard of Wilde's Globe, but it was erected in 1851. And you will recognize that that is very much in competition with the Great Exhibition. It was, in fact, in Leicester Square, bang in the middle. And there is a picture of this quite large edifice. And it contains, as is clearly written on the engraving, a monster globe. This shows the building of the monster globe, the trusses that were being put up for the building, and you can begin to see there the globe shape, as it says, for Mr. Wilde's large model of the Earth. And this is how it worked. It was extremely ingenious. There was the globe, but the representation of the continents and the mountains and the sea and the rivers and everything was on the inside. So if you went in and you could use the stairs and get onto the different levels of viewing platform, you could enjoy all the thrills of world travel without any of the inconveniences. It was indeed highly popular, and Wilde wanted to keep it going, but the lease could not be extended, and so after 10 years, in 1861, it disappeared. So, noting that this started life in 1851, and we note that the animals left the zoo in 1856, we're beginning to get a pretty good time bracket for our game. So, and in fact, we are more or less there. We've gone back to St. Paul's by our tour. The sites that we've missed out are more familiar. You can see on the left the number 38 Two Swords exhibition. On the right we have Westminster Abbey, and at 45 we have the Regent's Park Zoo. But I thought it would be more interesting for you to see some of the sites then that are less familiar, although we have now ended up at St. Paul's, and just to look at the sites that we've seen. I think that one of the first things that struck me when I put this particular slide together was how various were the interests of the Victorians. All of these are really shown as sites of London. So they include animals, they include museums, the places where you can learn about things, the Polytechnic, interesting buildings, but also scientific things. Very strong interest in things like the Thames Tunnel, the very strong interest in Wild's globe. And we then have places where you can buy things. You can buy at the Pantheon, you can buy at the Soho Bazaar. And these places were well patronized. Lowther Arcade was always busy, and so on. And you begin to feel that the Victorians were an interesting set of people, the Londoners, interested in everything, busy, a lot to celebrate. And then you reflect, perhaps everything wasn't quite as good as you might get from that brief description, because you have the Foundling Hospital. And I call to mind that picture of the chapel filled with children, all of whose lives had been broken, their mothers unhappy at having to leave them with a little token in the hope, maybe no more than a hope, of being able to get them back when times improved. So I hope you'll find that this game has given you some insights into Victorian London of the mid-19th century, as well as some interesting sites. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Adrian. What a fabulous tour around London. And I know that I would love to have a copy of that game and walk around all of those sites that you talked about. I didn't know about Wild's Globe either. So next time I'm in Leicester Square, I'll think of it. We do have a couple of questions. Firstly, a question here about where the Thames Tunnel was, and is it still there?
Yes. I should have explained that the Thames Tunnel is very much still there. Brunel's Tunnel runs across the Thames and carries the London Overground.
Thank you. I think sometimes through the Brunel Museum you can actually see parts of the tunnel. They sometimes do trips, so it's worth looking out for those online. I had a practical question actually about where these games were made and how they were made, and also who was buying and playing them.
Right, that's very, very good question. And I'm going to answer it in terms of games printed on paper rather than games printed on a handkerchief, because the handkerchief games are very rare and not particularly easy to answer the question because nobody really knows. But as far as the games on paper are concerned, you have to think about this as where are you talking about? So let's talk about England, and specifically talk about London, because pretty much all the games of this kind were manufactured in London. Hardly any in provinces, and hardly any in Scotland. Who bought them? Well, if we now concentrate on Georgian and Victorian times, these games were originally regarded as quite educational and were bought by the upper classes and the aristocracy for the education of their children. So we have games on history, we have games on geography, and those are the mainstays of the trade. There are many map games, many games of different kinds of history produced by most of the London makers in Georgian and Victorian times. And gradually this moves over into games of amusement, like the Cottage of Content that we saw, but that had quite a moral content as well. So that's a very brief introduction to a subject which really you would have to look at some, say, my book or other books on the history of these games, and I hope that gives you some starting points.
Thank you, Adrian. We've had a question here from Anna, who has said, thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I'm researching late 18th and early 19th century British games for my master's and variants of the game of goose. And I wondered if you're aware of any primary literary sources that describe how the games were played in practice.
That is extremely difficult. There are hardly any references to these games other than advertisements for the games. So you will find one or two recollections, particularly about the playing of the game of goose. I mean, the game of goose was implemented instead of a maze by the Duchess of Worksop, I think, by in Worksop. She actually planted a goose game in Hornbeam. So that, if you like, is some commentary on how the game was viewed. But primary literary sources, say, describing how the game was enjoyed or played or by whom, just really do not exist.
Thank you. Just a comment really from Doug here to say, brilliant presentation. I wish I'd come across these games a few years ago when I was doing various bits of London research. And I think, as you've illuminated in the talk, there is so much about London's history in particular that we still don't know. And actually it's objects of this kind that tell us actually how people were viewing, and also the importance of different buildings then to those audiences, which I think is quite interesting. Buildings we think today of being important were clearly,
yes, I did a talk,
clearly not the same.
Sorry, I did a talk for the antiquaries, the Society of Antiquaries of London, on the Georgian games, which looked around London. I looked particularly at the panorama of London, and a game of the pantomime of Mother Goose, which had the participants rushing all over London, and gave a lot of insights into particular buildings, places like Vauxhall and so on. So yes, these games are a useful source. Some of the games, like the panorama of London and the Darton game, have got little booklets with them. And in fact, the Darton game has got detailed descriptions of the buildings, some of which are quite unexpected. For example, the Darton game talks about the East India Company Museum, which is full of all sorts of material, that was brought, say, from New Zealand and Australia. And you would think that this would just be celebrated in a Victorian colonial way. Not a bit of it. The Darton family were Quakers, and they were by no means happy at the colonialization and the exploitation of native peoples. And this little booklet has really got some quite inflammatory stuff, saying that we would have done a lot better to leave these artifacts where they were. So I've been encouraging historians to use these as primary sources, and they really are useful in that respect.
Thank you. We've had another question here. Where was the Missionary Museum, and what happened to the clubs for their kings and other exhibits?
Yeah, it's a good question. That museum was in Whitehall, and what happened to it? As I was looking into it, I think some of the material managed to get itself into the British Museum, but others of it were sold at auction, and I have no idea where they've got to. I haven't managed to trace those particular items.
Thank you. And finally, just a question here from Doug, I think. Is there an online or an electronic version of your book rather than a publication that can be shared? Probably not.
I think there is the Amsterdam University Press have got an electronic version, but it's expensive. That's unfortunate. That's the trouble with academic.
Suggest going on their website if you're interested in getting a copy.
Yes, Amsterdam University Press. But it is a.
Sorry, Adrian, say that again.
It's Amsterdam University Press, but it's very much an academic book. If you want simply a book about these games, which is of a more popular kind, a sort of coffee table book, just Google my name and put vintage board games in, and you'll find a book on there which is much more approachable, affordable, and has now been published in a lot of languages. So that's shows how popular it's been.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your great questions. Adrian, I will make sure that everyone gets a copy of this recording because it's been such a fascinating talk. For anyone who would like to join our future talks in the Past and Present series, our next talk is on Wednesday, the 11th of May at 1 o'clock on illegitimacy, family and stigma in 18th century England with historian Dr. Kate Gibson. So please do join us for that. But thank you again, Adrian. And I'm so sorry about whatever's just happened, but thank you and good luck with all your future research.
Thanks, Narissa. Thanks for your help.
Okay, thanks. Have a good day. Bye-bye.